David walked into the gleaming conference room on the 40th floor, his leather briefcase feeling heavier than usual. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table, where 12 of the most powerful people in finance sat waiting. He had worked at Sterling Capital for 7 years, climbing from junior analyst to senior portfolio manager, and today was supposed to be his moment of triumph. The presentation he was about to give could change everything. For months, he had been researching what he believed was the investment opportunity of a lifetime. A new cryptocurrency project called Golden Chain promised revolutionary blockchain technology that could transform how banks handle international transfers. The numbers looked incredible on paper. Early investors were seeing returns of 300% in just 6 months. "Good morning, everyone," David said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. He clicked the remote and his first slide appeared on the massive screen behind him. "Today I want to share an opportunity that could generate unprecedented returns for our clients." The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. CEO Robert Sterling sat at the head of the table, his gray eyes fixed on David with an expression that was hard to read. Next to him sat the other executives, their faces showing polite interest mixed with skepticism. These people had seen countless presentations over the years, and they were not easily impressed. David launched into his pitch with enthusiasm. He explained how Golden Chain's technology was different from other cryptocurrencies. He showed charts demonstrating the potential for massive growth. He outlined a strategy to invest $25 million of the firm's money into this new venture. Everything seemed to be going perfectly until he reached the slide showing the team behind Golden Chain. "The founders," David continued, "have impressive backgrounds in technology and finance. They've raised over $50 million from private investors. And their advisory board includes former executives from major banks." That's when Robert Sterling leaned forward, his expression suddenly sharp. "David, can you tell me more about these founders?"
Have you personally met with them?
David felt a small tremor of uncertainty. "Well, no, not in person. But I've had several video calls with their representatives, and all the documentation checks out. Their offices are located in Singapore, which explains why scheduling has been challenging." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Robert's assistant quietly slipped him a tablet, and David watched as his boss's face grew darker with each passing second. "David," Robert said slowly, "I'm looking at a news report that was published 2 hours ago. Golden Chain has been exposed as a complete fraud. The so-called founders don't exist. The Singapore office is a mail drop. $50 million from investors has simply vanished." The words hit David like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face as he stared at the screen behind him, where his carefully prepared presentation suddenly looked like evidence of his own stupidity. The room was completely silent now, 12 pairs of eyes boring into him with a mixture of shock and disappointment. I don't understand," David stammered. "Just yesterday I received confirmation that everything was legitimate. The documentation, the regulatory approvals, the investor reports, all fake," Robert said, his voice cold as ice. "Every single document was fabricated. The regulatory approvals were forged. The investor reports were fiction. You've been chasing a ghost for 6 months, David, and you nearly cost this firm $25 million. David's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. He thought about all the hours he had spent researching Golden Chain, the late nights analyzing their technology, the confidence he had felt just minutes ago. How had he missed something so fundamental? How had he been so completely fooled? "Sir, I followed all our standard procedures," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I verified everything through our usual channels. The documents appeared authentic." Robert stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the table. "Your usual channels weren't good enough, were they? You were so eager to find the next big thing that you ignored basic common sense. You wanted to be the hero who discovered the golden opportunity, and instead, you've proven that you can't tell the difference between a legitimate investment and a sophisticated scam." The other executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. David had worked with most of them for years, had shared drinks after successful deals, had been invited to their homes for dinner parties. Now they avoided his eyes, looking down at their phones or staring out the window at the city below. "In 30 years of business," Robert continued, "I've never seen such a spectacular failure of due diligence. You didn't just miss red flags, David. You ignored them completely. You put our reputation at risk. You could have cost us our biggest clients." David opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain that the deception had been incredibly sophisticated, that other experienced investors had also been fooled. But the words wouldn't come. He stood there frozen as Robert delivered the final blow. "You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you out of the building. You have 10 minutes to clear your personal items from your office." The room remained silent as David gathered his papers with shaking hands. His briefcase, which had felt heavy when he entered, now felt impossibly light. He walked toward the door on unsteady legs, knowing that 12 of the most influential people in the financial world had just witnessed his complete professional destruction. As he reached for the door handle, Robert's voice followed him. "And David, I'll make sure everyone in this industry knows exactly what happened here today. Your career in finance is over." The elevator ride down 40 floors felt like it lasted forever. David stared at his reflection in the polished steel doors, trying to comprehend how quickly his life had changed. An hour ago, he had been a respected portfolio manager with a bright future. Now he was unemployed, humiliated, and about to become a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the city. Security waited for him at his office, watching as he packed his few personal belongings into a cardboard box. His colleagues pretended to be busy at their desks, but he could feel their eyes on him, could sense the mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them walking out in disgrace. 20 minutes later, David stood on the sidewalk outside Sterling Capital, holding a box containing 7 years of his professional life. The morning sun that had seemed so promising now felt harsh and unforgiving. People rushed past him on their way to work, oblivious to the fact that his world had just completely collapsed. 6 months later, David's alarm clock buzzed at 6 in the morning, just like it used to when he worked at Sterling Capital. But instead of reaching for an expensive suit, he grabbed a wrinkled polo shirt and khaki pants from the pile of clothes on his floor. His luxury downtown apartment was gone, replaced by a tiny studio in a neighborhood he never would have considered before. The place was so small that his bed, desk, and kitchen were all within arm's reach of each other. The coffee maker was broken, so he made instant coffee with hot water from the tap. As he stirred the bitter brew, he looked around his new reality. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbor's television through the night. The heating barely worked, leaving him wrapped in blankets most evenings. His savings account, once healthy enough to make him feel secure, now had less than $800 left. His phone sat silent on the counter. It used to buzz constantly with calls from clients, colleagues, and headhunters. Now the only calls he received were from bill collectors and his mother, who worried about him but lived too far away to help. His girlfriend Rachel had lasted exactly 3 weeks after he lost his job. She said she understood, but her actions spoke louder than her words. Their relationship couldn't survive the stress of his unemployment and the social embarrassment of dating someone who had become the laughingstock of the financial world. David grabbed his backpack and headed out to catch the bus to work. Yes, work. After 4 months of fruitless job searching, he had finally swallowed his pride and taken a position at TechFix, a small electronics repair shop downtown. The owner, an older man named Bill, had been desperate enough to hire someone with no experience in electronics repair. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but it was honest work, and Bill didn't seem to care about David's past as long as he showed up on time and learned quickly. The bus ride took 45 minutes, giving David plenty of time to think about how drastically his life had changed. He used to drive a BMW to work, listening to financial news and planning his day around million-dollar deals. Now he sat wedged between a construction worker reading the sports page and a student listening to music with headphones that leaked bass rhythms. He tried not to think about his former colleagues, who were probably arriving at the office in their expensive cars, discussing market trends over lattes that cost more than David now made in an hour. At TechFix, David spent his days learning to repair smartphones, laptops, and gaming consoles. His hands, once soft from office work, were now calloused and frequently cut from handling tiny screws and sharp metal edges. Bill was patient but demanding, expecting David to master each new skill quickly. The work was actually more challenging than David had expected. Electronics repair required precision, problem-solving skills, and the ability to diagnose complex issues with limited information. "You're getting better at this," Bill said as David successfully replaced a cracked screen on an expensive smartphone. "Most people take months to learn what you've picked up in weeks. You sure you never did this kind of work before? David smiled despite himself. It felt good to receive praise for his work, even if it was for fixing phones instead of managing portfolios. I guess I've always been good at figuring out how things work, he replied, carefully testing the phone's touch response. The customers at TechFix came from all walks of life. College students brought in laptops destroyed by spilled drinks. Small business owners needed quick fixes for their point-of-sale systems. Parents arrived with tablets their children had somehow broken despite protective cases. David found himself enjoying these interactions more than he expected. These people needed real help with real problems, and when he fixed their devices, their gratitude was immediate and genuine. During his lunch breaks, David often walked to a small park nearby. He would sit on a bench with a sandwich from the corner deli and watch people rushing to and from their important meetings. Sometimes he recognized faces from his old world, former colleagues or competitors who had probably heard about his spectacular downfall. He usually looked away before they could notice him, not ready to face their pity or judgment. One particularly difficult day, David ran into his former assistant, Lisa, at the coffee shop near TechFix. She had been friendly and efficient, always staying late to help him prepare for big presentations. When she saw him, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and then uncomfortable sympathy. "David, I didn't expect to see you here," she said, clearly struggling to find the right words. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing well," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just taking some time to explore new opportunities." Lisa nodded, but her eyes took in his worn clothes and tired appearance. "That's great. I'm sure something will turn up soon. You were always so talented." They made awkward small talk for a few more minutes before Lisa excused herself, probably late for a meeting that David would have once considered important. As she walked away, David caught his reflection in the coffee shop window. He looked older, thinner, and completely different from the confident man who used to command respect in boardrooms. The evenings were the hardest part of David's new life. His studio apartment felt more like a prison cell than a home. He couldn't afford cable television, so he spent most nights reading library books or browsing the internet on his aging laptop. Sometimes he would lie on his bed and stare at the ceiling, wondering if this was how his life would be forever. He thought about the dreams he used to have: the corner office, the house in the suburbs, the respect of his peers. All of that seemed impossible now. His neighbor in the apartment next door was an elderly woman named Mrs. Rodriguez. She had noticed him moving in with just a few boxes and had made it her mission to check on him regularly. She would knock on his door with homemade soup or fresh bread, claiming she had made too much for herself. David knew she was just being kind, but he was grateful for her concern. "You remind me of my son," she told him one evening as she handed him a container of rice and beans. "He went through a hard time 2 years ago, but he got through it, and so will you." David wanted to believe her, but some nights the hope felt impossible to maintain. He would lie awake listening to the city sounds outside his window, wondering if anyone from his old life ever thought about him, or if he had simply been erased from their memories like a bad investment that everyone preferred to forget. The job at TechFix was temporary, he told himself. He would eventually find a way back into finance, or at least into a career that used his education and experience. But as the weeks turned into months, that possibility seemed to fade further into the distance. He was surviving, but barely, and each day required tremendous effort just to maintain the pretense that everything would somehow work out. Late at night, when the loneliness became overwhelming, David would sometimes open his laptop and browse job listings, hoping to find something that might represent a path back to respectability, but most positions required references he no longer had, or came from companies that had probably heard about his failure at Sterling Capital. The financial world was smaller than most people realized, and bad news traveled faster than good news. Still, he kept going. Every morning he got up and went to TechFix. Every evening he returned to his tiny apartment and tried to figure out what came next. He was broken, humiliated, and nearly broke, but something deep inside him refused to give up completely. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was just the basic human refusal to accept defeat. Whatever it was, it kept him moving forward, one difficult day at a time. David's evenings had developed a routine that would have surprised anyone who knew him before his fall from grace. After returning from another day of repairing phones and laptops at TechFix, he would heat up a simple dinner, and settled down at his cramped desk with his old laptop. What started as a way to escape the loneliness had gradually become something much more significant, though he barely dared to admit it to himself. It began with an old college project that he had never finished. Back at MIT, David had been fascinated by the intersection of mathematics and market behavior. While his classmates focused on traditional financial models, he had become obsessed with the idea that market movements followed patterns that could be predicted using advanced algorithms. His professors had been intrigued but skeptical, and David had eventually abandoned the project to focus on more conventional coursework that would help him land a job after graduation. Now, with nothing but time and desperation, he had returned to those old ideas. The laptop hummed softly as complex calculations ran in the background, processing years of market data that David had slowly gathered from free financial websites. His tiny apartment had become a laboratory where he tested theories that had been brewing in his mind for over a decade. The work was incredibly difficult. David was essentially trying to teach a computer to recognize patterns in market behavior that human traders missed. He spent hours writing code, testing algorithms, and analyzing results. Most nights he would work until 3 or 4 in the morning, surviving on instant coffee and the determination that this might be his only chance to rebuild his life. At TechFix, his co-workers had no idea what he was doing in his spare time. To them, he was just David, the guy who had learned to repair electronics faster than anyone Bill had ever hired. He was quiet but reliable, showing up every day and doing his work without complaint. They sometimes invited him for drinks after work, but he usually declined, claiming he was tired. "You sure work a lot of overtime for someone who gets paid by the hour," joked Kevin, one of the younger technicians, as David once again turned down an invitation to join the group at a nearby bar. David just smiled and made some excuse about needing to catch up on sleep. The truth was that he was terrified of spending money on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Every dollar saved was another dollar he could potentially invest if his algorithm ever proved itself worthy of real money. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday night in November. David had been running his latest version of the algorithm against historical market data, testing how it would have performed during various market conditions over the past 5 years. The results made him stare at his screen in disbelief. According to his calculations, the algorithm would have generated consistent profits even during the most volatile market periods, including the major corrections that had wiped out many professional traders. His hands were shaking as he double-checked the numbers. There had to be a mistake somewhere. Algorithms this successful didn't exist, or if they did, they were closely guarded secrets owned by the biggest investment firms in the world. But no matter how many times he reviewed his work, the results remained the same. His system was predicting market movements with an accuracy that seemed almost impossible. David spent the next 2 weeks testing and retesting his algorithm, looking for flaws in his logic or errors in his calculations. He used different data sets, different time periods, and different market conditions. Every test confirmed what he had discovered that rainy Tuesday night. He had created something extraordinary. The question now was what to do with it. David had exactly $612 in his savings account, barely enough to buy groceries for the next month. Testing his algorithm with real money would require risking what little he had left, and if he was wrong about its effectiveness, he would be completely broke. But if he was right, those $600 could be the foundation of something much larger. He started small, investing just $50 in a conservative stock that his algorithm identified as undervalued. For 3 days, nothing happened. The stock price barely moved, and David began to worry that his system only worked on paper. Then, on the 4th day, positive earnings news sent the stock up 12%. David sold immediately, turning his $50 into $56 in less than a week. The profit was tiny, but it was real. More importantly, it proved that his algorithm could work in the actual market, not just in theoretical backtesting. Over the next month, David made a series of small trades, never risking more than $100 at a time. His success rate was remarkable. 8 out of 10 trades were profitable, and the profitable trades more than compensated for the losses. By December, his $600 had grown to nearly $2,000. David was still living in the same cramped apartment, still working at TechFix, still eating simple meals and wearing worn clothes. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time since his humiliation at Sterling Capital, he felt a spark of genuine hope. The algorithm was becoming more sophisticated with each iteration. David had taught it to recognize subtle patterns in trading volume, price movements, and market sentiment that even experienced professionals often missed. It could identify opportunities that appeared for just hours or days before disappearing, and it could assess risk with a precision that David had never seen in traditional financial models. At work, Bill noticed that David seemed different lately. He was still reliable and hard-working, but there was a new energy about him, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. "You seem happier these days," Bill commented one afternoon as David finished repairing a particularly complex laptop motherboard. "Things going better for you?" David looked up from his work and smiled genuinely for the first time in months. "Yeah, I think they might be." He couldn't tell Bill about the algorithm, of course. The work was too sensitive, and David had learned to be extremely cautious about sharing his ideas with others. But he was beginning to believe that he might have found a path back to financial security, and maybe even success. The trades were getting larger now. What had started as $50 investments had grown to several $100s per trade. David's account balance was approaching $10,000, a sum that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier. He was still incredibly careful, never risking more than he could afford to lose, but the consistent profits were building momentum. On New Year's Eve, while his neighbors celebrated with parties and fireworks, David sat at his desk running final tests on the latest version of his algorithm. The year had been the worst of his life in many ways, but it was ending with promise. He had discovered something remarkable, something that could change everything if he had the courage to pursue it fully. As midnight approached, David made a resolution that would have shocked anyone who knew about his cautious approach to the algorithm. He was going to quit TechFix and focus entirely on trading. It was a terrifying decision, but the numbers didn't lie. His system was generating returns that made his salary at the repair shop seem insignificant. The algorithm had given him something more valuable than money, though he was only beginning to understand it. It had given him back his confidence in his own abilities. For months he had believed that his failure at Sterling Capital proved he was incompetent, that he had been fooling himself about his talents all along, but the success of his algorithm suggested otherwise. Maybe he wasn't a failure after all. Maybe he was just getting started. Outside his window, the city celebrated the arrival of a new year with hope and optimism. Inside his tiny apartment, David quietly prepared for a transformation that would shock everyone who thought his story was already over. The algorithm was more than just a trading system. It was proof that his greatest success might be yet to come. David gave his notice at TechFix on a cold January morning, telling Bill that he had found a new opportunity in consulting. It wasn't entirely a lie, though Bill would never have guessed that the consulting involved algorithms and trading rather than electronics repair. Bill seemed genuinely sorry to see him go, offering a reference and telling David that he would always have a job there if things didn't work out. What followed was the most intense year of David's life. Working from his tiny apartment, he refined his algorithm and gradually increased his trading positions. What had started as careful $50 investments evolved into sophisticated trades worth thousands of dollars. His success rate remained remarkably high, and the profits compounded at a rate that sometimes kept him awake at night, staring at his account balance in disbelief. By spring, David had quietly accumulated over $200,000. He moved to a slightly larger apartment in the same neighborhood but maintained his low profile. To his neighbors and the few people who knew him, he was just a freelance consultant who worked from home. He dressed simply, drove an old Honda Civic that he had bought with cash, and lived modestly despite his growing wealth. The algorithm had evolved far beyond his original concept. It now analyzed thousands of data points simultaneously, including traditional market indicators, social media sentiment, news patterns, and even weather data that could affect commodity prices. The system could identify opportunities that appeared for just hours before disappearing, and it could assess risk with mathematical precision that David had never seen in traditional financial models. As his success became more consistent, David began attracting attention from unexpected sources. The electronic signature of his trading pattern was noticed by sophisticated monitoring systems used by high-net-worth individuals and institutional investors. These people lived in a world where information was everything, and they had ways of identifying successful traders even when those traders preferred to remain anonymous. The first contact came through an encrypted message that appeared in David's email one morning in June. The sender identified himself only as interested party and asked if David would be willing to discuss a potential business relationship. Normally, David would have deleted such a message immediately, but something about the professional tone and the technical sophistication of the encryption made him curious. The meeting took place in a private dining room at an exclusive restaurant downtown. David arrived to find a well-dressed man in his 60s who introduced himself simply as Robert Chen, though David suspected that wasn't his real name. Chen was polite but direct, explaining that he represented a group of investors who had noticed David's trading pattern and were impressed by his consistent returns. "We're not interested in your methods," Chen said over an expensive lunch that David couldn't have afforded just months earlier. "We respect your intellectual property. What we're interested in is access to your results. We have significant capital that we would like you to manage, and we're prepared to pay well for the privilege." David listened carefully as Chen outlined the proposal. These investors wanted to give him $50 million to trade on their behalf, keeping their identities completely confidential. In exchange, David would receive substantial fees plus a percentage of the profits. The arrangement would be structured through offshore accounts and shell companies, ensuring complete privacy for all parties involved. It was the kind of offer that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier, when David was struggling to pay rent and eating instant noodles for dinner. Now, with his algorithm proving itself month after month, the proposal felt like a natural evolution of his success. David accepted the offer, but insisted on strict conditions. He would maintain complete control over trading decisions. His methods would remain proprietary, and most importantly, he would continue to live quietly, with no public recognition or publicity. Chen agreed immediately, explaining that his clients valued discretion above all else. The partnership began in August, and the results exceeded everyone's expectations. David's algorithm performed even better with larger amounts of capital, identifying opportunities that were only available to investors with substantial resources. Within 6 months, he had generated returns that made his previous success seem modest by comparison. More offers followed. Word traveled quietly through the exclusive networks of ultra-wealthy individuals who were always seeking new investment opportunities. David became increasingly selective, accepting only clients who understood the value of absolute privacy. His fees and profit shares grew accordingly, creating wealth at a pace that sometimes made him dizzy. By the end of the year, David's personal net worth had crossed $10 million. The money sat in various accounts and investment vehicles, carefully structured to minimize taxes and maximize privacy. He had achieved a level of financial success that exceeded anything he had imagined during his days at Sterling Capital, yet virtually no one knew about it. His lifestyle remained deliberately modest. He moved to a comfortable but unremarkable apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, bought reliable but ordinary clothes, and continued to tell people that he worked as a consultant. When his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, asked how his business was going, he would smile and say things were improving, which was perhaps the greatest understatement of his life. The isolation was both a blessing and a burden. David's wealth had given him complete financial freedom, but it had also cut him off from normal human relationships. He couldn't talk about his work with anyone, couldn't share his success with friends or family, couldn't even enjoy the visible symbols of wealth that most people associated with financial success. Sometimes he would walk through the financial district where he used to work, passing the building that housed Sterling Capital. He wondered what his former colleagues would think if they knew that the man they had dismissed as incompetent was now managing hundreds of millions of dollars and generating returns that would make them envious. But he kept walking, maintaining the anonymity that had become both his protection and his prison. The algorithm continued to evolve, becoming more sophisticated with each iteration. David spent his days monitoring markets, refining his systems and managing an increasingly complex web of investments and client relationships. His clients trusted him completely, sending wire transfers worth tens of millions of dollars based solely on his track record and the recommendations of other satisfied investors. By winter, David had to acknowledge a reality that still seemed surreal. His personal wealth had grown to over $50 million, and the capital he managed for others had reached nearly $500 million. He had become one of the most successful traders in the world, yet he remained completely invisible to the financial media and public attention that usually followed such achievement. The success was intoxicating, but David never forgot the lessons of his spectacular failure at Sterling Capital. He remained obsessively careful about risk management, never betting more than he could afford to lose, always maintaining diversification and liquidity. The algorithm was powerful, but David knew that markets could be unpredictable, and overconfidence had destroyed many successful traders throughout history. As he sat in his apartment on a cold December evening, reviewing the year's performance and planning for the future, David reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. 2 years ago, he had been broken, humiliated, and nearly bankrupt. Now he controlled resources that exceeded the annual budgets of many companies. The money was extraordinary. But what truly amazed David was the quiet satisfaction of proving that his original instincts had been correct. He had always believed that markets followed patterns that could be understood and predicted. His failure at Sterling Capital had made him doubt those instincts, but his algorithm had vindicated them in the most dramatic way possible. The best part was that no one saw it coming. While the financial world continued to view him as a cautionary tale of hubris and failure, David had quietly built something remarkable. His revenge wasn't public or dramatic. It was mathematical, precise, and absolutely devastating to anyone who had underestimated him. The man they had written off as incompetent was now richer than most of them would ever be, and they had no idea it was happening. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in March. David was reviewing overnight market activity from Asian exchanges when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Normally, he would have let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Is this David?" The voice was shaky, elderly, and filled with desperation. "This is Mrs. Rodriguez, your old neighbor. I got your number from the apartment manager. I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call." David's blood ran cold. Mrs. Rodriguez had been one of the few bright spots during his darkest period, bringing him homemade meals and checking on him when no one else cared. She'd been like a grandmother to him, and hearing the fear in her voice made his stomach clench. "Mrs. Rodriguez, what's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm in the hospital," she whispered. "The doctors found something. Cancer. They say there's a treatment that might help, but my insurance won't cover it. It's experimental, and it costs more money than I've ever seen in my life. $2 million. David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. Mrs. Rodriguez had worked as a cleaning lady for 40 years, saving every penny to support her family. $2 million might as well have been $2 billion for someone in her situation. "The doctors say I have maybe 6 months without treatment," she continued. "With the treatment, I might have years. But I can't ask my children to go into debt like that. They have their own families to worry about." "Mrs. Rodriguez," David said gently, "don't worry about the money. I'm going to take care of this." There was silence on the other end of the line, then a small laugh. "David, you're sweet, but you can't possibly afford something like this. I just wanted to call and thank you for being so kind to me when you were going through your own hard times." David smiled, remembering how she used to worry about him when he couldn't afford groceries. "Mrs. Rodriguez, trust me on this. The treatment will be paid for. You focus on getting better." After hanging up, David immediately called the hospital and spoke with the billing department. Within an hour, he had arranged for Mrs. Rodriguez's treatment to be fully funded through an anonymous donation. He used one of his shell companies to make the transfer, ensuring that the source of the money couldn't be traced back to him. But hospitals have strict protocols for large anonymous donations, especially those involving experimental treatments. The administration launched an investigation to verify the legitimacy of the funding, and despite David's careful precautions, the trail eventually led back to him. It took 3 weeks, but a persistent investigator finally connected the shell company to David's name. The first news report was small, buried in the back pages of a local newspaper. Former finance executive makes anonymous $2 million hospital donation. But in the tight-knit world of finance, news traveled fast. Within days, the story had reached the financial blogs, and then the major news networks picked it up. David watched the coverage with a mixture of amusement and apprehension. The reporters, had dug into his background, recounting his spectacular failure at Sterling Capital and his subsequent disappearance from the financial world. The story that emerged was compelling. The disgraced executive who had quietly rebuilt his life and was now wealthy enough to make million-dollar charitable donations. His phone started ringing constantly. Former colleagues who hadn't spoken to him in over 2 years suddenly wanted to reconnect. Reporters requested interviews. Investment firms that had once blacklisted him now wanted to discuss potential opportunities. David ignored most of the calls, but one voice message made him pause. "David, this is Robert Sterling. I think we need to talk." The meeting took place in the same conference room where David had been humiliated 3 years earlier. But everything felt different now. David walked in wearing a well-tailored suit, his confidence restored and his financial position stronger than anyone in the room could imagine. Robert Sterling sat at the head of the table, looking older and more tired than David remembered. "I'll be direct," Robert said after the initial awkward pleasantries. "Sterling Capital is in trouble. We've made some poor investment decisions over the past 2 years, and we're facing significant losses. Our biggest clients are threatening to leave, and frankly, we need help." David listened without expression as Robert outlined the firm's problems. Poor risk management, failed ventures, and a series of bad bets had brought the once prestigious company to the brink of financial disaster. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. "I know this is awkward," Robert continued, "given our history. But the fact that you've obviously been successful enough to make major charitable donations suggests that you've found your footing again. We're prepared to offer you a senior position, full autonomy over your investment decisions, and a substantial compensation package." David leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. 3 years ago, these same people had destroyed his career and his reputation. Now they were begging for his help, still having no idea of the true extent of his success. "Robert," David said calmly, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in a job." Robert's face fell. "I understand. Given what happened before, I suppose it's too much to ask for you to come back here." "You misunderstand," David said with a slight smile. "I'm not interested in a job because I don't need one. My current net worth is approximately $100 million. The silence in the room was deafening. Robert stared at David as if he had spoken in a foreign language. The other executives shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to process what they had just heard. That's not possible," Robert stammered. "You were unemployed. You were working at some repair shop." "I was," David agreed. "And during that time I developed something that you and everyone else in this industry said was impossible. I created an algorithm that can predict market movements with unprecedented accuracy. Over the past 3 years, I've used that system to generate returns that have made me wealthier than anyone in this room." David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder containing account statements and performance reports. He slid it across the table to Robert, who opened it with trembling hands. The numbers were staggering: consistent monthly returns, compound growth that seemed almost magical, and a track record that any investor would kill for. "The golden chain incident that got me fired," David continued, "it taught me the most valuable lesson of my career. It showed me that I was relying too much on other people's research and not enough on my own analytical abilities. So I developed a system that doesn't depend on anyone else's due diligence. It analyzes pure market data and finds patterns that human traders miss." Robert looked up from the papers, his face pale. "Why are you telling us this?" David stood up, straightening his jacket. "Because I'm prepared to help Sterling Capital, but not as an employee. I'll provide consulting services and access to my trading system. But I have conditions." "Name them," Robert said immediately. "First, you publicly apologize for the way you treated me 3 years ago. Second, you implement new policies to ensure that no employee is ever humiliated the way I was. Third, you establish a charitable foundation dedicated to helping people like Mrs. Rodriguez who can't afford medical treatment." David paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who had once dismissed him as incompetent. And finally, he continued, "You acknowledge that the man you called a failure has become more successful than any of you ever dreamed of being." Robert nodded slowly, still staring at the performance reports. Done. All of it. When can you start? David smiled, remembering the security guards who had escorted him out of this building with a cardboard box of personal belongings. I'll have my lawyers draw up the consulting agreement. But Robert, next time someone on your team makes an honest mistake, remember this conversation before you decide to destroy their career. As David walked out of Sterling Capital for the second time, he felt a sense of closure that had eluded him for 3 years. He had proven that his failure wasn't the end of his story, but merely the beginning of a much more remarkable chapter. Mrs. Rodriguez called him that evening to tell him that her first treatment had gone well, and the doctors were optimistic about her prognosis. She still didn't know that David had paid for her treatment, and he planned to keep it that way. Some victories were best enjoyed in private. The financial media had a field day with the story of David's comeback. The headlines wrote themselves, "From disgrace to fortune, the $100 million comeback." But David barely paid attention to the coverage. He had learned that true success wasn't about recognition or revenge. It was about having the freedom to help people like Mrs. Rodriguez, the satisfaction of proving his critics wrong, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing he had survived the worst and emerged stronger than ever. 3 years ago, David had walked out of Sterling Capital as a broken man. Now he was walking back in as someone who had achieved the kind of success that most people could only dream about. The humiliation that had once seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of the most extraordinary chapter of his life.